He said keep moving. It was just a joke. And my grandson froze in the sixth grade corridor like a bird clipped mid-flight. Posters arguing over 2 holidays flapped on the bulletin board. Tile light harsh as a hospital, bleach and cafeteria onions in the air. While the hall monitor smirk held the doorway like a gate, rings flashing under the fluorescents, eyes sliding over the boy as if he were a scuff to be buffed out. I watched his shoulders fold to half their size, watched laughter ripple in the edges like heat above asphalt, and felt that old, precise anger rise, the kind that doesn't shout, only counts. I am his grandfather, and I know the weight of rooms where arrogance wears a badge and the hurt is told to wait. So I gather my folder, the handbook tabbed, the district circular worn from the printer, a pen that will not skip, and I turn toward the office with the cold clarity of a scalpel, because tonight we will trade smirks for procedure, rumor for record, and I will set something on the table that cannot be waved away, even if it means the whole building has to listen. One request before the next scene: subscribe, comment where you're watching, and share this story. Light spreads when we pass it on. The first cut came quiet. My grandson stepped off the bus with his shoulders folded in on themselves, eyes fixed on the crack that runs through our front walkway. He didn't cry. He didn't have to. Shame hangs a different weight than tears. It drags the breath low and leaves the hands restless. I smelled the diesel fog the bus always leaves, and beneath it the faint bleach from our morning mopping, and I knew I was about to ask him to walk back with me into the place that hurt him. I kept my voice steady as I gathered what I always keep for days like this: a thin folder with a copy of the student handbook, a printed district circular from this quarter, a ruled notebook, 2 paper clips, 1 blue pen that never skips. The folder clicks when it closes. I like that sound. It says the pieces are in order. He watched my hands, not my face, and nodded once. We left the porch and took the sidewalk past the maple that always leaks sap on hot afternoons. The air had the aftertaste of cafeteria onions drifting from down the block. In my pocket, the hard edge of the pen tapped my thigh in time with my steps. By the time we reached the school, the afternoon had tipped toward evening. Buses were gone. A custodian rolled a barrel of fresh trash bags across the entrance, and the rubber wheels made that slow, sticky squeal. The doors breathed out cold air and the sharp scent of toner. A flyer taped to the glass had 2 dates printed bold at the top, both circled, each claiming a different memory. I took that in and put it aside. I was not there to pick one memory over another. I was there to put events on paper so they could stand. Inside, the foyer hummed with fluorescent lights that flattened everything to a thin gray. A poster board leaned against a stack of color printers, waiting for a student to reclaim it. My grandson's footsteps veered closer to me. I laid a hand briefly on his shoulder and felt the muscle jump, like a bird startled under a bush. We turned right toward the front office. The reception desk had bowls of paper clips and a plastic tray labeled forms. I asked for the incident form in the same tone I would use to ask for a bus schedule. Nothing high, just a request that starts the track. Paper slid. A hand reached. A form appeared. It had neat boxes for date, time, location, roles present, description. It smelled faintly of the warm machine that had just birthed it. I wrote the date that would follow him if we did this right, the time he had told me, the corridor outside the 6th grade classrooms, the presence of a hall monitor and a cluster of students between bells. I wrote what happened without adjectives. Paper doesn't need adjectives to carry weight. The school counselor stepped out from a side door with the careful smile of someone trained for crisis. Her badge flashed under the light. She took in my grandson, took in me, and took in the form I was anchoring to the desk.
I recognized her face from open house nights and safety drills. The first thing I noticed was the way her fingers worried the lanyard, a small circular motion as regular as a clock tick. She started to speak, and I didn't move. I let the silence tell her I was writing something with edges and a protocol around it. She adjusted her tone, said we could sit in a side room while the office processed the paperwork. I asked for a timestamp for receipt and a copy of the policy section that filtered speech in the building. She reached for a clipboard and made a note. We were shown into a room that smelled like burnt coffee and copy dust. The table had a scar across it like a river on a map. My grandson took the chair nearest the door and folded his backpack strap into a tight rope. I opened my folder. Out came the handbook, tabbed with sticky flags where language lives. Out came the circular from the district about respectful conduct during community discussions. Out came my notebook, its first page already lined with boxes for time, place, person, function. I placed the incident form on top like a compass. When my hand touched the paper, the chill of it traveled up into my wrist and settled there, a steadying weight. I wrote the corridor's layout. I wrote the position of the posters on the bulletin board, the height of the clock, the angle of light from the outside door. I wrote the distance from the water fountain to the 6th grade wing. I wrote that the comment my grandson heard did not arrive alone. It came with snickers and a quick flick of eyes toward a flyer with a ship printed on it, as if the past could be a mascot. I did not write names of children. I wrote roles and positions. If a policy is a bridge, you cross it with facts, not fury. The door eased open and a security guard leaned in to manage the trickle of people wanting signatures after school. His radio hissed with short codes. I noted his name, his function, his presence in the corridor while we sat. He nodded back at me the way professionals do when they recognize another professional in a different uniform. Through the office window, I could see a hall monitor moving slowly, checking doors, and I logged the time. The form's boxes began to fill in with tight lines of print. Ink skated, paper held. The counselor returned with a fresh cup of coffee, steam lifting in a thin line that evaporated before it reached the fluorescents. She had the school's copy of the policy section I requested, and she set it near my compass. You learn things from how people place documents. Confidence has a way of lowering the paper flat. Doubt leaves it crooked. Her pages landed straight. She asked us to be patient while she checked with administration. Patience is a muscle you keep supple by using it on purpose. I told my grandson with a glance that we were in the right lane. Time in rooms like that rearranges itself. The tick of the air vent fan becomes a measure, the scratch of my pen a second hand. On the table, my notebook gathered a history of the hour. 3:42 arrival, 3:48 form requested, 3:52 form received, 3:58 counselor arrives, 4:07 policy copy provided. Next to those entries, I wrote small squares that could be checked later if anything needed verification or signatures. On the glass, a laminated emergency map showed colored arrows. The red one pointed toward an exit. I think about exits when I'm choosing to stay. You decide better when you know you can leave. A librarian appeared in the doorway with a cart of paperbacks, the kind with cracked spines that smell like old glue and dust. She saw my grandson, saw the papers, and made a simple gesture toward the clock, like she was pinning the moment for herself. I wrote librarian present, 4:13, potential witness to timeline. She didn't linger. People who love books learn when to move quietly.
I reread what I had written and fastened the policy copy to the back of the form with one of my paper clips, the heavy kind that doesn't bend wrong under pressure. My grandson's breathing eased enough that I could hear the soft click in his sinuses. That means he is coming back into his body. I slid the clipboard toward him and asked him to review the location and time entries with his eyes. His finger traced the lines and stopped at the minute of the bell. I updated it by 1 minute. Small accuracy gives large comfort later. Footsteps passed in the hall, brisk and unhurried.
The late afternoon light slanted through the narrow pane of glass and painted a gold rectangle across the table scar. I smelled the last run of the copier. The receptionist's phone rang twice and stopped. A distant locker door banged, then settled. The ordinary noises of a school after hours kept me steady. Ordinary noise means procedures still work. The counselor reappeared with a printed slip stamped received and the school's letterhead ghosting through the page. She placed it by my notebook and said the assistant principal would review the form now. I asked that the review include a note to preserve camera footage covering the corridor and that our request be recorded. She made another note. The security guard's radio hissed again, a soft burst to coded syllables, and he stepped aside to let someone pass. I packed nothing away. This was not a moment for closure. It was a moment for keeping the surface of things visible. The incident form stayed in the center of the table, a square of paper with a heartbeat under it. My grandson's backpack strap had loosened. His hands were no longer white at the knuckles. He looked at the policy section and then at me, like an engine catching. Outside the little room, I heard the whir of the laminator spitting out something stiff. The building was still making things official. The second hand on my watch lined up with the stamped time on the receipt. I underlined both. The counselor told us there might be a short wait while administration arrived from a meeting elsewhere in the building. I nodded. Waiting is not the same as drifting. I wrote, waiting, 4:29, administration en route, and drew an arrow to remind myself that forward movement can be quiet. The door to the inner office clicked. Somewhere down the hall, a set of firm steps approached, not rushed, not dragging, the kind of stride that clears its own path. And the sound came straight toward our room and stopped just on the other side of the threshold as a hand reached for the knob. The hand turned the knob, and the assistant principal stepped in wearing a jacket that still held the dry chill of the hallway. He didn't sit. He scanned the room, starting with the counselor, then the security guard's shoulder patch, then the papers spread in front of me, as if there was a correct order to look at people. He asked if we were the ones with the form. We were. He asked if we could move to the conference room for privacy. Privacy, in schools, usually means fluorescent lights and a table with chairs that wobble. We followed him down a short corridor that smelled like floor wax and old markers. The conference room was long and narrow, a soft hum from the air vent making the blinds shiver. There was a cold coffee ring near one head of the table. I placed the incident form at the center again, my compass back on the map. My grandson took a seat beside me and tucked his feet under the chair like he might need to spring up fast or anchor down hard. The assistant principal introduced himself, stated his function, then picked up the form and weighed it in his hand like paper could tell him how heavy the moment was. He started with the soft words: misunderstanding, tensions in the community, a teachable moment. Each phrase landed on the table and slid toward the edge. I steadied them with the policy I had clipped, pointing to the section on language that causes harm in shared spaces. The counselor stood at the whiteboard and wrote the date and time for the wall to see. The security guard stayed at the threshold like a hinge.
My grandson breathed through his mouth the way he does when the air feels crowded. I placed my free hand on the table so he could see the slow tap of my finger, a metronome set for patience. The assistant principal asked if I would describe the corridor again. I did. The posters near the 6th grade wing, the crowd between bells, the hall monitor's position in line with the water fountain. He wrote notes in a small book with paper so thin the pen left shadows on the next page. He asked if we would mind waiting while he consulted the director. Waiting again. Waiting has a way of stacking when people think time is neutral. He left with the form. The door settled. The room's hum returned to its lonely note.
My grandson took out his tablet and opened the notification screen, then scrolled to the morning. He showed me the district message that had pinged our house at 7:42 a.m., a reminder about respectful conduct during community discussion week. The time glowed small in the corner of the screen. I wrote it down, 7:42 notice sent, content relevant to policy. I asked the counselor to record that the message exists and that we were submitting our snapshot as a reference. She nodded, scribbled, and then paused with her marker hovering, as if unsure which line deserved the ink. A custodian rolled in a portable projector cart, realized it was the wrong room, and rolled it out again, without apology or announcement. The cart's squeak trailed down the hall like a wound-up toy losing heart. The counselor offered us water from a cooler that coughed a bubble before it poured. My grandson took a paper cone and held it with both hands, the cone trembling just enough to make the surface quiver. He did not spill. The first small humiliation arrived in the shape of a missing pen. The assistant principal returned and asked me to restart a section of the narrative on a duplicate form because the original would be scanned and routed, and they found it easier when both copies were handwritten. I handed him my pen. He said it would be better if I used a school-issued pen for consistency. The school-issued pen skipped. I rewrote the lines with the skip stitched through them like weak thread. The counselor apologized and found another. It scratched like a nail across a coin. I rewrote the lines again. The assistant principal thanked me for my cooperation. The second humiliation came in the choreography of chairs. When the director's office called for me, only one chair had been cleared at the far end of the table, while the rest were angled like spectators. The counselor corrected it quickly, pulling two into place. I noted how quickly, and I let that speed calm me. People can fix small things when they see them. The assistant principal said he had requested the corridor footage for the time range we documented. I asked that the request be logged with a specific preservation window. The counselor wrote preserve footage, corridor, 12:25 to 12:35, request by guardian on record, and dated it. I asked for a copy of that note for our packet. She slipped the carbon paper behind the page and rubbed hard with her palm until the blue bled through. The security guard's radio hissed a code. He murmured a reply and stayed at his post. Parents began to drift by the glass window, drawn by habit to the office after work hours. Some glanced in, then away, the quick look people give a storm cloud that might or might not hit their street. The librarian reappeared, slid a small slip of paper to the counselor with 2 times written on it, then vanished again with her card. The smell of her cart's old paper hung on the doorway for a breath. The assistant principal opened the door and invited us to a smaller room so he could call the director without the foot traffic at our backs. This room had a laminate table still sticky at the edges from a cleaning wipe. A small refrigerator clicked to life and then fell silent again. On the wall, a poster about conflict resolution had thumbtack holes in all 4 corners and 2 extra where someone missed. The assistant principal placed the form carefully, a deliberate square in front of me, and dialed a number from a card. While it rang, he told me he appreciated how specific my entries were, that not everyone arrives with policy sections tabbed or keeps their inks dated. Appreciation is a word that sometimes stands in for permission. I didn't need permission, I needed process. He got through to the director and summarized what sat between us. Incident reported, form filled, policy attached, request to preserve footage, mention of a morning email relevant to context. He listened, said yes twice, and ended the call with a clipped thanks. He informed us the director would review the form immediately and that a short internal reading would precede any community step. Then came the small accumulation that can grind a person down. A printer jam when they tried to make our receipt copy, a login screen demanding credentials for the preservation request, a network hiccup that logged them out before the confirmation screen, a stapler that ran out of staples on the last document, a box of staples with a plastic wrap that refused to tear. Each hiccup is nothing alone. Together they make friction where you need glide. I breathed with the rhythm of the refrigerator's clicks and waited for the room to catch up. My grandson, quiet until then, leaned his shoulder against mine. The pressure was a soft human fact. He opened a notes app and without a word built a simple timeline in 3 lines. Lunch bell, corridor, comment. After school return with Grandpa. Form requested, policy copied, footage requested. He added 7:42 a.m. at the top like a heading. I nodded and wrote a line in my notebook, witness of order, not voice raised. The assistant principal slid the fresh receipt toward me, the ink still damp, and asked if we would be willing to wait while the director read the form herself. Willing is not the word for it. My bones were set to this chair until the page made its next move. I said yes. He left again, and the room listened to itself breathe. Somewhere outside, a band practice thumped a drum twice and stopped. A laugh burst in the hallway and then died when it met our door. The blinds made faint zippers against the window frame as the air vent pushed weakly. The counselor cleaned a patch of table no one had touched. My grandson traced a groove in the laminate with a fingernail, then folded his hands until his knuckles lined up like a ridge of little stones. Time wore its soft clothes, but I would not let it curl up and sleep. I reviewed the policy again, the phrases about environment and impact, not intent. I underlined impact with the school pen until the line went dark enough to ignore the skips. I rechecked the preservation note for the footage and the receipt time. I filled my lungs to the bottom and let them empty without hurry. Footsteps approached again, heavier than before, a pair of them in a rhythm that suggested 2 people keeping the same pace. The security guard shadow crossed the frosted glass, then a second shadow behind it. The assistant principal opened the door without entering fully, stood aside, and the director stepped into the room with a blue folder pressed flat against her chest, the incident form visible in the clear front sleeve, and I watched her eyes drop to the policy section I had clipped as she reached for the chair and began to sit. The chair legs whispered against the floor as she sat, the blue folder pressed flat like a bandage. She opened it and slid the incident form out with both hands, centering it on the laminate table so precisely that the edge aligned with a scuff in the surface. Her perfume carried a clean citrus note that didn't quite cover the copier dust. She looked first at the policy section I had clipped, then at my grandson, then at me. Her voice came even and careful, each word set down like a glass on a crowded shelf. She said she wanted to understand the corridor, the timing, who stood where. She said the school was navigating sensitive conversations in the community and was committed to respectful conduct. Commitment is a promise you measure in the small turns of a day. I nodded and placed my notebook beside her folder, the pages already mapping time and squared off lines.
She asked to hear it again. I gave the corridor back to her. The 6th grade wing, the posters on the bulletin board showing 2 different dates, the hall monitor inside of the water fountain, the tide of bodies between bells. I described the moment my grandson's shoulders tucked themselves smaller, the quick glance toward a flyer with a ship, the snickers that travel like static and burn a little patch behind the ear. I kept names out of it. I kept roles in. The assistant principal wrote in his thin paper book. The counselor stood at the whiteboard and added the times like anchors. The first small grind arrived wrapped in courtesy. The director asked for my grandson's name, then said it wrong twice. She corrected herself on the 3rd try, a wince tightening the skin around her eyes, and told him she was sorry for what he had experienced. Sorry can be a clean cloth or a dust cover. I watched which kind she was offering. My grandson, steady beside me, kept his eyes on the incident form like it was a path he could walk with his feet. She asked about the morning message. I told her we had the 7:42 notice on the tablet and that the counselor had recorded it. The assistant principal asked if we could send it to a central address and then remembered he didn't have the login for that account from this room. He wrote himself a note. The counselor's marker squeaked and then dried mid-stroke.
She dug through a drawer for another, found one that bled too wide, then found a fine tip that finally behaved. The line of time on the board resumed. Through the glass, a slice of hallway kept moving. Backpacks, a trombone case, a pair of shoes that squeaked with every other step. The security guard shifted his weight, and the radio hissed a code that sounded like a cough. The room had a thermostat that clicked without changing the air. The temperature of paperwork tends to settle somewhere between not enough and too much. I unfolded a single sheet from my notebook and placed it next to the form, a rough outline for a collective apology and a mural proposal. Sketched the way I build bridges in my mind with spans and supports and a river of people moving under it. 3 layers, I said. The first, the land and the people who knew its steps before anyone named it a property line. The second, streams of families who crossed into this town across decades, the push and pull of hope and work. The third, the navigations that carried both glory and harm. No crowns, just a map with room for every foot to find a place. I said it didn't replace procedure, it was what could hold afterward. The director read the outline without touching it, her eyes tracking the sentences like a scanner beam. She said she appreciated community-minded ideas and set the page aside with 2 fingers, not on top of the incident form, not under it, a careful middle place, as if the paper might stain. The assistant principal asked if I would note the witnesses present when the corridor moment happened. I wrote hall monitor, cluster of students, security guard down the hall, librarian visible later by the elevators. The counselor whispered she would check with the librarian for an exact time record. Whispering implies discretion. I took it as care. Parents started to collect in the hall like rain beginning. One peeked in, another passed slowly, then a small knot paused near the door. The director glanced at the clock and said there might be a brief open segment later to hear from community members, but first an internal review. She used the word internal as if it were a neutral place. Neutral is often where decisions go to be softened. A man from tech services arrived with a sealed thumb drive and a sheet of chain of custody, the plastic wrapper making a crisp sound when he peeled it back. He said the file held the corridor window we had requested. He placed the drive on the table and handed the paper to the assistant principal, who read the hash aloud like reading a serial number on a box. The director nodded, the counselor scribbled the numbers to match, and the tech man wheeled in a projector on a cart that studded over the transition strip into the room. He plugged it into a wall socket that sighed, then into a laptop that flashed a login field, and then another. The screen on the far wall blinked blue, then gray, then the school's emblem that looked like a river made of arrows.
Another small wearing of patience. There weren't enough chairs for the new arrivals, so 2 more were dragged in and their plastic feet squealed. The director chose the end seat, closest to the projector light path. My grandson leaned in toward me until our shoulders met. He smelled faintly of cafeteria apple slices and the fabric softener I'd used that morning. His jaw unclenched. He opened his notes app again and added the line. Tech service arrived with sealed drive, hash recorded. I wrote it in my notebook too, duplicating care. The director asked the assistant principal to summarize before they played anything. He did, the words careful, the policy title precise. While he spoke, the tech man navigated directories, a quick forest of folders and dates, until he found the time frame and hovered his mouse. He clicked once. The projector warmed to a low hum that felt like a small engine idling. The blinds were pulled half shut, the room's edges cooled by a degree. On the wall, a frozen frame appeared. Corridor, bulletin board with flyers, a slice of the water fountain, a wedge of afternoon light flattening the floor tile. The counselor looked at me and then at the director, asking if we should dim the lights more. The director said to leave them at half so notes could be made. The parents in the hall edged closer. The security guard shifted again, and the door breathed open an inch. Somewhere behind us, a copy machine attempted to feed a page and caught the corner, the complaint carrying down the hall like a soft animal whine. The tech man moved the mouse to the play triangle. Oppression is not only loud doors closed in your face. It's the request to retell the same corridor in 3 different rooms, as if precision could evaporate between chairs. It's the optional pen that isn't optional after all. It's names bent to fit other people's mouths. It's each pause sold as patience while the hour turns heavy. I kept my breath measured. The incident form sat still, a square of resolve. The librarian slipped in, handed the counselor a note with 2 times written on it, moments she had seen the boy and the cluster by the 6th grade wing. She tapped the board quietly with her finger, marking her memory on the line, then slid back out like a book reshelved. The smell of her cart lingered, that glue and paper smell that dusts your throat. The director folded her hands and said she would read the form aloud after the footage so that the sequence lived in one place. The assistant principal placed the receipt on the table so its wet ink wouldn't ghost onto anything else. My grandson kept his eyes on the screen and not on the doorway. He traced the ridge of the table scar with his thumb. The hum of the projector steadied. The tech man clicked play. The computer deferred to a security pop-up asking for credentials to access a protected directory. He typed. The field shook its head. He tried again, slower, and the box trembled once more and stamped a red line under the name. He swallowed and said the account needed a different authorization path because the clip had been flagged for restricted access once the preservation request was filed. The director asked him to escalate. He called a number. A voicemail picked up. He hung up and tried a second number on a laminated card taped to the laptop with yellowing edges. The phone rang twice, then 4 times. He drummed 2 fingers on the card and stopped himself. He looked at me. He looked at the screen. He looked at the incident form as if it could vouch for him. Behind us, the hallway picked up a new current. A few more bodies, a breath held by people who weren't sure if they were meant to be part of this or to slip by. The counselor wiped her palms down the sides of her cardigan, then picked up her marker, then set it down again without writing. The assistant principal checked his watch and then looked at the thermostat like time might be hidden in there. The director kept her hand still.
I heard my own breath, the air vents mutter, the faint buzz of a light ballast going tired. The projector's fan went up 1 notch. On the wall, the frozen corridor waited like a held note. The tech man tried a 3rd login, a longer sequence, and the cursor blinked in the password field as if tapping its foot. Then the authentication box slid back across the screen and asked for a higher level key. If this moment speaks to you, like it, comment your view, and share. Each click invites another witness. The request for a higher level key hung on the screen like a locked door with good lighting. The tech man cleared his throat and asked permission to elevate. The director nodded and slid a single-page authorization across the table for my signature, acknowledging restricted access in a supervised setting. I read it. Room identified, personnel present, purpose limited to internal review. Assigned with the school pen that still skipped, pressing hard enough that the line didn't break. The tech man called a district number printed at the bottom of the laminated card. This time a voice answered. asked for the hash, the time window, the case ID on our receipt. He read them all carefully, and I watched his knuckles adjust on the phone as if tightening a valve. A code arrived by text to the laptop. He typed it in, hit enter, and the box stepped aside without fanfare. The projector softened the room to a hush. The frozen corridor gave way to motion. Kids moving in the casual hurry of an in-between minute. Shoulders sliding past backpacks, the bulletin board a patchwork of flyers painted in two histories. The picture had no sound, but the room heard enough. Rubber soles on tile, vents breathing, a distant printer coughing up a page. The camera angle was fixed high, a sober witness. My grandson held his breath for 2 frames, then let it go in a measured stream. We watched the clock inset in the frame crawl toward the moment we had recorded. The hall monitor crossed from the water fountain to the classroom cluster. A small knot of students rotated in and out of view. My grandson walked into the frame, his gait narrower than usual, his eyes finding the way the floor tiles run like rails. I remembered the flick spark of laughter he had described, but the camera gave only mouths moving and bodies angling. What mattered was distance and presence. The counselor called out each position in a low voice, confirming the geometry we had drawn with words. The assistant principal marked times on his thin paper book, 1 column for camera clock and 1 for our watch. The librarian slipped back in and pointed quietly to the minute she had noted earlier. Her handwriting on the whiteboard met the clock with the kind of relief that feels like a joint finding its socket. The clip ran through the key stretch and then a little beyond. The director asked the tech man to pause, rewind 8 seconds, and play again, slower. He did. The hall monitor's head turned precisely when my grandson's shoulders tightened. That was enough alignment for saying anyone we had imagined the air. The director told the tech man to reseal the file. He ejected the thumb drive, dropped it in a tamper-evident bag, wrote the time, and had the assistant principal sign the chain of custody sheet. The librarian copied the hash into the corner of our receipt. The room exhaled as a unit. I thanked the librarian for her exactness. She nodded once and said she would write a simple statement about her position and the times, nothing beyond what she saw. The security guard noted the preservation request had been logged and flagged. The radio on his shoulder whispered a calm code. The director looked around the table, her eyes moving over the papers, then over my grandson, then back to the policy section, and said the internal review would reflect what we had just documented. Internal this time sounded like a gear newly greased. We stepped out of the smaller room into a hallway thick with the neutral energy of end-of-day schools. The copier had given up its complaint. The light along the baseboards had warmed by shade. The assistant principal said they would open a brief segment in a nearby room to hear community comments and outline immediate steps. He asked if we wished to attend. I said we would. My grandson tucked his tablet under his arm and walked in a straighter line.
The community room was not large, but it echoed. Chairs were set in tidy rows. Posters about digital citizenship and lab safety hung a little crooked, the tack holes telling you they had been moved around for assemblies and science fairs. A faint sweetness of dry erase solvent lived in the air. Parents stood along the walls, arms folded and then unfolded as they shifted, the posture of people trying to decide if they were observers or participants. The counselor placed our receipt and timeline on a side table and wrote agenda on the whiteboard with a marker that, blessedly, did not fail. The director summarized, not with color but with order. Report filed, policy attached, timeline established, video reviewed under authorization, preservation secured. She used the phrase impact over intent, and I watched the room register it not as an accusation, but as a setting on a dial. The assistant principal noted immediate next steps for their staff: language training refreshers, clearer protocols for when students raise concerns, and a defined path for mediation that does not require a parent or grandparent to know all the right questions to ask. He wrote dates beside those commitments, not someday, but calendar squares. When the director asked for comments, 3 hands rose. A mother spoke softly about her daughter's nerves during this week of layered conversations and asked for a space where students could process without having to choose a side in a long story they didn't write. A father said he wanted his son to learn that history is many rooms, not one throne. A teacher in the back, sleeves still folded from aftercare duty, mentioned a resource they had used last year to talk about community memory without pushing students into debate postures. The room leaned toward practical. I raised my hand and was recognized. I kept it short. I said we had followed the procedure because that is what holds when feelings are raw. I said I had brought a draft for a collective apology that centers the effect on students who were hurt and models how to repair without spectacle or scapegoat. And I said I had a mural proposal that would give the campus a place to hold its layered story. Land first, then the streams of families, then the vessels of exploration and commerce. No figure crowned above the others, just the truth that many hands have touched this place, and that the future will require more hands, gentler on the handle. I set the paper on the table and stepped back. The art teacher crossed to the table and read the proposal with his lips moving, like he does when he's planning supplies. He said the materials were manageable and the design could be supervised by staff, with students composing sections that fit the 3 layers. A handful of parents came forward and signed their names on a new page the counselor slid next to the proposal. The librarian added hers, squeezed between 2 signatures with neat script that kept its own margins. The security guard leaned in long enough to see the page and then went back to the door where he belonged. The director thanked everyone for keeping the tone on process. She said the school would take the mural proposal under consideration as part of an educational response, along with the training and mediation steps. She did not promise a ribbon cutting. She promised dates to revisit progress, and she wrote those dates on the board. The board looked different with real days on it. The room's echo softened. The assistant principal handed me copies, our stamped receipt, the preservation note, the chain of custody record for the video review, and a brief outline of immediate actions. Paper has a temperature when it matters. These sheets were warm from the printer and purpose. I tucked them into my folder in the order they had been born. My grandson placed his notes on top and looked at me the way he does when the air is settling again around his ribs. Relief for him is quiet. I let it be quiet. The counselor approached and asked for a moment. She said she had started the day thinking patience would make things better and was ending it, understanding that process is what keeps people from having to beg for patience. She asked if we would be open to a mediation circle, not as a theater, but as a structure where the harm is named and the next steps are agreed to with someone watching over the words. She said she would email options and asked my grandson if he would like to bring a friend for support. He nodded once. She smiled with the corners of her mouth only, then went back to packing away markers. We walked out of the community room into a corridor that smelled briefly of citrus from a freshly mopped patch near the water fountain. The bulletin board still held its 2 histories, but their edges looked less like swords and more like bookends. The evening had settled itself respectfully over the campus. The security guard held the door long enough for 3 people to pass. The copy machine down the hall spit a final page and went still. My grandson adjusted the strap on his backpack and looked at the spot where the hall monitor had stood in the footage,
as if he wanted to measure the distance with his own shoes. I checked my watch against the receipt. The numbers matched. I stowed my pen, the school's pen, and the spare they had given me in a straight line inside the folder. My hand passed over the draft apology and the mural sketch, and I felt their weight change from idea to possible. We thanked the director, the assistant principal, the counselor, the librarian, the art teacher, and the guard, not in a line, but in the flow of a hallway where people finish work and carry the building home on their shoulders. Outside, the air was clean and cool. A thin stripe of sunset cut the parking lot in half and made the asphalt smell almost sweet. We crossed to the sidewalk. My grandson kept pace with me, steps even, the gears inside him no longer grinding. I told him without speaking that we were not done, only steady. He nodded without speaking, that steady was enough for tonight. We turned toward home with papers that could bear weight, and the world around us made the small sounds of evening that tell you procedures will be waiting in the morning where you left them. The auditorium smelled like pencil shavings and old varnish, the scent rooms keep when they have seen too many school years to count. A slow murmur folded and unfolded over the plastic chairs as people settled, then stilled when the gavel tapped wood. The board table ran the length of the stage like a low dam. Behind it, 5 faces, a row of name placards, water cups sweating on paper coasters. The director sat center with the blue folder that had followed us through rooms, the assistant principal to her left, the counselor farther down, a district representative wearing a lanyard with too many keys. I kept my folder on my lap, the incident form at the top, receipt and chain of custody tucked beneath, the mural sketch flattened to behave. They opened with the case summary, no color, only order, report filed, policy attached, timeline established, video reviewed under authorization, preservation secured. The district representative read 2 paragraphs from the language policy about environment and impact, the words carrying like measured steps down a hall. Then they called for the internal findings. The director lifted the blue folder, looked at my grandson first, then at me, then at the page. She stated, for the record, that the corridor footage and corroborated timeline supported our description, a comment that targeted a student's origin in a shared space, witnessed by a hall monitor who did not intervene, a response atmosphere that minimized the harm under the banner of waiting. She said the school would recognize the incident according to the policy as a violation of language standards in a communal area. The hall changed temperature by a breath. People who had come to see heat found the steadier thing they were not expecting, a straight spine. She continued, voice even. For staff, she said, there would be structured training on language and impact. For the hall monitor, a formal note and required coaching. For the counselor, a supervisory plan to ensure intake is triaged to procedure before comfort. For the assistant principal, a directive to remove redundant obstacles in report routing. She did not add scorn to the words. She attached consequences to functions. That is what I had asked of the day.
The board chair opened a short window for additional comment. A teacher described a classroom practice that might help students name hurt without turning the room into a court. A parent said he wanted his son to learn repair as a civic act. The art teacher offered a timeline for the mural project staged across 3 weekends with student design groups. The librarian, quieter than the rest, spoke last. She said rooms like this often make people choose loudness or withdrawal, and she was grateful to watch a third choice build itself, a path where paper, time, and witness do the lifting.
They moved to the items. First, the recognition of the incident under policy, with an accompanying written apology from the institution to the affected student and family, focused on effect and on commitments. The board voted. Hands rose, then the gavel touched wood. Second, training and protocol updates with scheduled checkpoints. More hands. The room did not cheer. It exhaled. Third, the mural as an educational response with student participation under staff guidance, framing the campus history as layered rather than rival. The chair paused before this vote like one pauses before a step in dim light. Hands went up, not all, but enough to carry the motion across. The gavel noted the crossing. The director invited my grandson to share a brief statement if he wished. He looked at me, then at the paper he had written on his own desk at home, and stood. His voice was not loud, it was steady. He did not describe the corridor, he didn't need to. He spoke 12 lines about how words can make a person feel like a door is closing in a place that promises to be open. He asked for the apology to be published as a letter pinned to the board where everyone could see it, not to shame a face, but to show a standard. He asked that the mural include spaces at the edges for future hands to add names of those who help keep the place kind. When he sat, the room had grown quieter than the microphone could capture. The chair thanked him and moved to acknowledgments. The counselor spoke, not defensively, but with the frankness of someone who passed through a narrow place and saw its shape. She said she had believed patience would cool a hot moment and had learned the thing I carried with me all afternoon, that process is what keeps people from having to beg. The assistant principal followed, saying he had found ways the forms rattled through too many trays before they landed, and he outlined a simpler route, scanning at intake, immediate routing to 2 desks instead of 4, a preservation request that asked for confirmation once instead of twice. He looked at me when he said it. I let my chin nod once, enough to confirm receipt. Then the hall monitor, who had sat near the back, stood without being called and asked to read a short note. The chair agreed. He said he had been trained to watch for movement and missed the stillness that means harm arrived in a sentence. He said the training would help him see both. He did not ask the room to feel for him, he asked for permission to change. That is more than many places ever say aloud. The board adjourned the voting portion and reopened the floor for the mural plan. The art teacher wheeled out a cart with scrap plywood and sample paint chips, the bright smell of latex waking up the room's wood and paper throat. He described a composition that starts with the contour of the land around the school, traced by students from maps, as layers representing people who lived in the ride, and finishes with the routes that carried sequences of hope and harm, the upper third broken into smaller panes that students can feel with symbols of contribution. He held up a small square showing 3 hands laid palm down, the tones different, the tendons drawn in clean pencil lines. The room tilted forward. I walked my mural sketch to the end of the table and set it beside his plan. The director studied both, one under each hand, the same way she had placed papers all day, careful, deliberate, as if weight could be measured through fingertips. She nodded, once, then twice, and said the project would proceed under staff supervision with volunteer support, with a presentation to the board at each stage. She turned to the counselor
and asked her to coordinate mediation in the coming days, so the apology would not be a sentence alone on the wall, but part of a set of acts.
The chair tapped the gavel and declared the session closed. The audience did not burst into talk. People stood in twos and threes, touched elbows, tugged at sleeves, breathed. My grandson slid his hand into mine, not to hold himself up, but to anchor a moment that didn't want to float away too fast. We remained in our seats while the row emptied, listening to the soft stick peel of chair feet lifting and the rustle of paper being gathered into briefcases. The director walked over, blue folder now thin, and offered me a clean copy of the acknowledgement letter she would send. She didn't say the word closure. She said, "Thank you for your order." It sounded right. We stepped outside into air that had cooled into clarity. The parking lot surface had that faint sweetness with the day's heat finally chased off of it. A bus went by on the far street with its windows cracked open just enough to let out a chord of children's laughter that did not belong to us and did not need to. The sky above the school held a single long cloud trimmed with pink where the sun reached it. The building behind us clicked as thermostats and ballasts found their night sound. At home, I laid the papers on the kitchen table in the same order I had carried them in the rooms: form, receipt, chain of custody, preservation note, mural outline, action plan. My grandson placed his statement on top. We looked at them the way people look at tools after a job, checking edges, admiring the simple fact that they work. I felt my shoulders drop a fraction. Not victory like a flag, steadiness like a floor that will not give when you shift your weight. The consequences were written now, not hoped for. Training scheduled, supervision plans signed, an intake path that wouldn't ask a family to push a boulder uphill to be heard, a public acknowledgement that would live where eyes pass every day. The mural would take time and hands, and that was proper. Repair is not one brush, but many. I washed my hands and watched the thin line of water trace my lifeline before it disappeared in the sink. My grandson leaned against the counter and watched me the way he did as a toddler, taking his cue from how I set things down. We didn't talk. The house's noises made their small promises, the refrigerator's low purr, the window's cord tapping gently, the street's hum thinning to a thread. Breath went in and came out. The day had left its marks, but it had left them where they could teach. I returned the incident form to the folder, pressed the metal prongs flat, and slid the notebook in beside it. The folder clicked. The sound landed soft and complete in my chest. I sat and let the chair take my weight fully for the first time since the bus pulled away in the afternoon. My grandson unfolded a fresh sheet of paper and with slow, careful letters wrote a line at the top to start the mural's border. He did not ask what to write. He already knew. Justice that whispers outlives outrage that shouts. When hurt asks for a stage, I give it a procedure so the future has room for respect, union, and contribution. If you stayed to the end, leave a like, subscribe, and tell me what you do, especially if it were your family. Until next time.